So now we're going to talk about temperatures and thermometers. Thermometers are really important. It's very difficult and almost impossible to look at a food and say this is done to the right temperature and that all the bacteria is killed. So that's why a thermometer is really important, is to know exactly what temperature your food is to make sure that you've killed off any bacteria that might cause you illness. So we're going to move from left to right. We're going to start off with the most basic thermometers. So these thermometers are called dial thermometers, and that's because it simply is a dial as opposed to a digital thermometer, which will display only the temperature that your food is at that point in time. And we have two different ones here. It's important to note whenever you work with a thermometer that it includes the range of temperatures that you're going to be working with. So for instance, the one that I have in my left hand goes from 0 to 220 degrees, which is really great for stovetop cooking or general all-purpose kitchen cooking. And the reason for that is that you can use it for cold foods to make sure that it's below 40 degrees, or you can use it for hot foods to make sure that it's above 140 degrees. So it's important to keep foods either below 40 degrees or above 140 degrees. In between those two, so 41 to 139, is considered the danger zone. And that's where bacteria can grow and become very dangerous the most. So we've got some water boiling behind us. I'm just going to go ahead and turn that down a little bit, and we'll talk about what we're going to use that for in a little bit. This next thermometer goes from 50 degrees to 550 degrees, which is great for on the stove top cooking and to test foods that you're pulling out of the oven. This particular thermometer cannot be used inside the oven, cannot be baked with, but you can pull out your foods and test the temperature of your foods and then put them back in the oven if they're not up to temperature. Whenever you insert a thermometer inside of meat, you want to make sure that you're inserting the thermometer away from bone and away from fat and the thickest part of the meat. Whenever you take temperature of any food, you want to make sure that you're sticking it into the thickest part of the food to make sure that it's either cooled completely into that thick internal temperature or to make sure that it's heated completely to the thickest part of the food. So these two thermometers are your basic thermometers and probably the least expensive that you can get. You can get them at your local kitchen store. You might even be able to find them at your local general retail store. After that, we have some that are a bit more fancy. Here we have a digital type thermometer that includes a couple extra bells and whistles. It has a probe, and so this sensory device can be stuck inside of your food at a distance as opposed to what you have with the dial thermometers. This actually can be inserted into the food while it's cooking. You need to read the manufacturer instructions to make sure that your specific device is capable of being put in the oven and cooked to very high temperatures. And this will keep an eye on your food and alert you to when it reaches a temperature that you've programmed it to reach. So for example, if you wanted to cook beef and you wanted to cook it to 165 degrees, you could have this beep whenever this internal temperature of the beef gets to 165 degrees. This also comes with a timer and several other bells and whistles that aren't exactly necessary, but are really nice and handy to have. Another bells and whistle is this type of thermometer that also includes a digital temperature reading. It includes a probe as well. This one cannot be used in the oven. This one also has a fancy device where it has what we call an infrared scanner, where you can scan the surface temperature of food. A scanning type thermometer is not generally used in the common household kitchen. Part of the reason is because they're so expensive, and the other reason is we don't want the surface temperature of a food, we want the internal temperature. But if you have one of these, you can use the probe to stick it into, again, the thickest part of the food and find out the internal temperature. Next, we have a meat thermometer. So this one is specifically used for meat. So again, when we check the range, this range goes from 120 degrees to over 200, about 220 degrees. Generally, meat's cooked within the range of 145 degrees to 165 degrees, depending on what type of meat that you're working with. So for chicken and poultry, you want to make sure that it's 165 degrees. For beef, you want to make sure that it's 155 at minimum. And for eggs, you want to make sure that they're 145 at minimum. So this is great because it's got a very sturdy stem and you can stick it right into the meat. Some of them you can cook with them in the oven and some of them you cannot. You need to again check your manufacturer's instructions to make sure what your thermometer is capable of. While I have this thicker stem in my hands, it might be a little easier to see. On most thermometers that have a probe, there's going to be a divot or a bevel or a dimple somewhere on the stem that's going to indicate what we call sensing area. The sensing area is where the thermometer has a device in it that's going to calculate the temperature of the food. So you need to make sure that when you insert your thermometer into your food, that it's inserted up to and beyond the bevel. So you want to make sure that whatever you're sticking your thermometer into, that you've got about 3 or 4 inches of food to place your thermometer into. When you're reading your thermometer, you do want to give it some time to get up to the temperature or get down to the temperature of the food. Again, read your manufacturer instructions. It depends on the thermometer. Usually about 30 seconds is all that's needed. Here we have one type of candy thermometer. There are several different types of candy thermometers. There's glass ones. There's also flat metal ones, and you can use whichever one you like. They all work really well. This one specifically goes from 100 degrees Fahrenheit to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, which are needed for candy making. So when you use a candy thermometer, that's one thing you want to look for, to make sure that it has a very wide temperature range, again from 100 to 400 degrees. And so this would be a great time to talk about an oven thermometer. Oven thermometer is a type of thermometer that you can place inside your oven. It can stay there while the food is cooking, and it'll let you know the actual temperature inside of the oven. Not all ovens are perfectly calibrated. They don't all work the same, and sometimes they have hot and cool spots. So that's why you'd want to use an oven thermometer, to make sure that what you've programmed your oven to be set at is actually the temperature that it is on the inside of the oven. Again, read the manufacturer instructions on where to place these and how to use them. When it comes to storing food, we want to make sure that we're storing foods in safe temperatures. So again, the refrigerator or freezer. And those refrigerators should be 40 degrees or less, and the freezer should be less than 32 degrees. Here we have a refrigerator or freezer thermometer. It can be used for either the refrigerator or the freezer, and you can place this where it's going to be easily visible when you open up the door, and where you can find out the exact temperature of your refrigerator. These are really important for if you live in, especially in an area where you might experience power outages often. That way, if there is a power outage, keep your refrigerator completely closed, and when the power comes back on, you can open the door and see what the temperature is. And if the temperature is below 40 degrees, your food should be safe. If your refrigerator is above 40 degrees, you're going to need to discard the foods that are in your refrigerator and freezer. So this is also a really handy thermometer to have. Again, check your manufacturer instructions for your thermometer on how to use these thermometers, where they need to be placed, and if it's possible to calibrate them. So whenever you're using a thermometer, you want to try to calibrate it if possible, or at least know how far off the mark it is. So one way to do that is to use boiling water. At sea level, water will boil at 212 degrees. For every 1,000 feet above sea level you are, you're going to need to subtract 1 from that number. So if you're 1,000 feet above sea level, your water will boil at 211 degrees. If you're 2,000, it'll boil at 210 degrees, so on and so forth. So it's important to know your altitude. So in order to calibrate a thermometer, at least know how far off the mark you are, I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to take this thermometer, a dial thermometer specifically, and they usually come with a sheath. It's important to protect the probe as often as possible. And just this sheath specifically has a holder for your thermometer, and it has this odd-shaped hole, and that's so that you can adjust the thermometer nut at the very back bottom of the thermometer. Not every thermometer is designed this way. This is specifically how this thermometer is designed. So again, check your manufacturer instructions on if it can be calibrated. So my water here is boiling. We're going to go ahead and turn that off. And when we insert our thermometer, we're going to make sure that it's not touching the sides or the bottom. And again, it's important to make sure that that sensory probe is covered. So we're not touching the bottom. And we need to keep the thermometer in the water submerged the whole time. And again, read your manufacturer instructions. This one should take about 30 seconds. It's always nice to have something to protect your hand. So if your thermometer doesn't come with a sheath that has an extendable thermometer holder, you might want to grab a pair of tongs to hold it over the hot water. Just going to turn this so you can read it. Again, you want to make sure that you're not touching the bottom of the pan, you're not touching the sides of the pan. And give it the full time. So here, we haven't gotten to 212 degrees, which is what we should have gotten for our area. So at this point, I would either adjust and calibrate the thermometer with the tools provided, or if that wasn't possible, I would write it down in my kitchen somewhere where it would be easy to find so that I would know exactly how far off my thermometer is. Thermometers are generally going to be off by about 2 degrees, and that's perfectly standard. But anything more than 2 degrees you're going to need to note down. So in this case, we're well off the mark, so we're going to go ahead and adjust our thermometer to be at 212 degrees. With this, again, you're going to place the thermometer inside the nut and turn it so that it reaches the mark. But again, read your instructions and make sure that you're calibrating your thermometer to your manufacturer's instructions. Some thermometers cannot be calibrated in that fashion, so you'll use this hot water method to find out what the thermometer is going to read, and then note somewhere in your kitchen how many degrees it is off the mark.